The first thing I noticed was the lock. Not because it was broken, because it wasn't. A broken lock means panic, noise, a boy with bad timing and worse judgment. This one had been opened by somebody who thought expensive and careful were the same thing. The latch sat a little too clean. The metal sat half a notch off where I always left it. Most people would miss that. Most people do not spend 40 years learning that tiny errors are where the real damage starts. The cryogenic room was cold enough to sting the inside of my nose. White vapor curled off the tank collar and hung low around my boots. The gauges were fine. The alarm log was quiet. The room looked healthy. If I had been lazy, I would have walked out, poured coffee, and thanked God the equipment had held. Instead, I opened the ledger. Then, I checked the rack positions. Then, I checked them again. One canister had been lifted and returned. Not badly, not by some drunk idiot with bolt cutters, by somebody who either had help or had done enough homework to become dangerous. 3 straws were missing from one line. 2 embryos were gone from another. Not the flashy material, not the pieces some tourist would point at in a catalog. The exact mix you would take if you wanted to fake originality without spending 20 years earning it. That was the moment I understood what kind of man had touched my room. A thief takes value. A fraud takes structure. Those tanks did not hold inventory. They held time, breeding stock, stored semen, embryos, corrected mistakes, dead ends that had taught me something. A few bloodlines I had no intention of letting loose into the hands of men who treat heritage like branding. That room was not a freezer. It was where most of my life actually lived. People like to imagine a breeding program as barns, trailers, sale days, trophies, maybe some old photographs on an office wall. That is because most people only understand the parts of a business that make noise. The real work is usually somewhere quieter. A notebook nobody asks about. A field nobody photographs. A freezer room nobody respects until a man with money decides it is the fastest way to steal years. You can rebuild a burned barn. You can replace a truck. You can recover from a bad season if you know what you're doing. But if a man steals the right frozen genetics, he is not taking money off a shelf. He is trying to enter your future wearing your name. I did not call the sheriff. That is where weak storytellers ruin a story like this. They hear theft and they think noise. Report, press charges, cameras at the gate, some righteous little local scandal for people who enjoy seeing other men's work reduced to gossip. That works when somebody steals diesel, jewelry, or equipment. It does not work when the real crime is not the taking. It is what the taking is meant to become. If I had reported it that morning, I would have gotten a case number, an insurance conversation, and 3 months of whispered garbage about whether I had lost control of my own program. If the wrong people got to it first, I would have become the old breeder with the slipping memory, the loose staff, and the convenient grudge against new money. Men with enough attorneys can turn almost anything into fog if you challenge them before they have finished exposing themselves. And in my business, fog is useful to exactly the wrong people. A dead calf is visible. A broken fence is visible. A flood is visible. Fraud likes paperwork, polite voices, and committees full of men who want one more week before they decide whether the obvious thing is truly obvious. If I move too soon, I would not just be accusing a thief. I would be volunteering my own name to be handled by cowards. So, I closed the ledger. I checked the backup storage. I locked the room again. Then I stood there with my hand on the tank lid and understood something with a kind of ugly clarity. Nobody had stolen from me to survive. He had stolen from me to arrive. I breed registered cattle. High-end, old money, low volume, reputation first cattle. The kind of program that looks slow to outsiders because the people inside it know that rushing bloodlines is what desperate men do. In my world, a family can spend 2 generations building a female line and still speak about it like they're apologizing for being early. Nobody serious says disruption. Nobody serious talks about dominating the industry over lunch. If you hear that kind of talk, you are usually standing next to a man who bought boots yesterday. Money enters this business all the time. Money is welcome. Worship is not. That distinction confuses men who got rich in rooms where speed mattered more than memory. A few months before I found the tank touched, a hedge fund millionaire bought the Hartwell place next to mine. His name was Graham Voss. The Hartwell place used to be a ranch. Voss turned it into a costume in under 90 days. He resurfaced the drive before he repaired the fencing, put imported stone around the entry before he understood the water system, built a tasting room where the old sale office had been, because apparently he believed a man shopping for breeding stock needed the same emotional experience as a woman booking a vineyard wedding. He installed a glass-walled office over the barns so he could look down over the place like he was inspecting a kingdom instead of overpaying for feed. He had the kind of confidence men develop when every bad idea in their life has been padded by money. He smiled too hard, talked too loud, wore expensive denim that had never spent a day in weather, flew people in, hosted dinners, sent Christmas baskets like he was running for office. The local bank president liked him. The regional ag magazine loved him. Men with average cattle and above-average insecurity began orbiting him immediately. Because that is the other thing money buys. It does not buy respect. It buys volunteers. The first time he came to my place, he pulled up in a truck that looked absurd on my gravel and stepped out like the ranch itself ought to be grateful for the visit. He walked my main barn slow, asking polished questions in the tone of a man who had already decided curiosity qualified him. He pointed at cattle and asked whether I had ever considered scaling the line nationally. He asked what my exit horizon was. He asked whether I had thought about licensing the brand more aggressively. That sentence told me all I needed to know. A man who says that about bloodstock has never loved an animal in his life. I told him no, not because I was rude, because I meant it. He kept smiling. Men like him always do that at first. They think refusal is the opening bid. He said I had a legacy program with untapped upside. I told him I had a breeding program, not a software company. He laughed like that was charming. It wasn't. It was the laugh of a man who has spent his whole life mistaking tolerance for admiration. What Voss wanted was not cattle. Cattle were the ticket. What he wanted was pedigree, invitation, recognition. He wanted old ranch families to stop seeing him as a loud financier who had purchased acreage and start treating him like he belonged at private syndicate dinners, elite sales, and closed-door conversations about blood instead of branding. He wanted entrance into a room built by patient people, and he wanted it on hedge fund timing. That kind of appetite is worse than greed. Greed is honest. Status hunger dresses itself up. He came back 2 more times that spring. Once with a bottle of bourbon he thought would soften me. Once with a consultant who kept saying, "strategic breeding asset," like he was testing whether I might die of disgust right there in the aisle. Voss circled the same questions every time. Foundation females, stored semen, old crosses, retained material, what I would release if the number became serious enough. I gave him the same answer every time. Some material was never for sale. He nodded like he respected boundaries. He didn't. He was measuring them. There are men who hear no and move on. There are men who hear no and start looking for a side door. Before the theft, he had already begun doing a softer kind of trespass. Not into buildings, into atmosphere. He showed up at local meetings where nobody had invited him to speak and somehow ended up speaking anyway. He sponsored a junior livestock scholarship dinner and had his name printed twice on the program. He bought a table at the county conservation banquet, then spent the evening behaving as if conservation existed mainly to give him a podium. He was not trying to fit in. He was trying to crowd the room until people confused exhaustion with acceptance. That kind of man is easier to read than he thinks. The men who truly belong somewhere never need to announce that they do. By the time I found that tank touched, I knew 2 things. First, whoever went into that room knew enough to take the right pieces and leave the wrong ones. Second, there was only one new man in my world stupid enough to believe lineage could be stolen clean. I did not accuse him. I started with my own house. I went through access records, staff routines, camera blind spots, deliveries, service calls, fuel slips, back gate times, feed invoices, vet visits, and 2 months of harmless little disruptions that stopped looking harmless once I lined them up correctly. I did not find a smoking gun with his name engraved on it. Real life is rarely that kind. What I found was shape. A delivery that arrived 20 minutes early on a day it had never arrived early before. A maintenance call that should have taken one man and somehow involved two. A temporary hand asking the wrong question about storage temperature. A lunch table comment where Voss mentioned embryo transfer timing with the fake ease of a man reading from a world he had not earned entrance into. Not proof, direction. That was enough. Years earlier, after watching too many shallow men buy old names and try to turn them into marketing tricks, I had built a quiet protection into my line. Nothing theatrical, nothing illegal, nothing some brochure could brag about. Just microscopic marker patterns placed where they belonged, documented where they needed to be documented, and invisible to anybody who believed money made them thorough. It was the kind of safeguard a serious man hopes he never needs and keeps anyway. Not because he expects betrayal every morning, because he understands what modern ambition looks like when it gets bored. That was when I understood the difference between stopping him and ending him. Stopping him would have been easy enough. Public accusation, lawyers, a loud fight, maybe a settlement, maybe some ugly compromise, maybe a mess big enough for half the industry to call it a misunderstanding because that would be cheaper for them emotionally. Ending him meant patience. It meant letting him build value on top of the lie. It meant waiting until the fraud was not just suspicion in my cryogenic room, but a market claim in public air. Most men can't do that. Anger feels useful. Patience feels like swallowing glass, right up until the invoice shows up for the other man. So I said nothing. That summer, Voss got busier. He hired a photographer before he hired enough ranch help, put out glossy private mailers with soft-focus barn shots and language about a new American standard. Started speaking at regional gatherings like he had discovered something instead of purchased proximity to it. People laughed at him in private and accepted his dinner invitations in public, which is a very American way to help a problem mature. He spent money the way children throw feed at fish. He renovated sail ring seating, sponsored a hospitality tent, bought ad space in places where respectable men usually let their cattle speak. Then the rumors started. Quiet at first. Voss had serious foundation stock. Voss had assembled a selective donor base. Voss was building something different. Voss was not just rich. Voss had vision. Whenever I hear that word in this business, I start looking for the lie attached to it. He also had a trick I had seen before in smaller men with smaller budgets. He liked to speak about old standards in the language of rescue. He would stand at a rail or lean over a dinner table and say the industry needed fresh blood, modern management, broader reach, stronger positioning, global storytelling. Men who had done nothing but inherit middling herds would nod because he made them feel less guilty about never building anything serious. Women who actually knew cattle would go quiet and study him the way you study a stain spreading across good fabric. He was not offering improvement. He was selling permission. Permission for mediocre men to believe the craft had been too slow. Permission for insecure men to believe tradition had wronged them. Permission for buyers who wanted prestige without homework to pretend a polished brochure meant the same thing as a proved line. That is how fraud recruits. Not with evidence, with relief. I went to an industry dinner in late fall because not showing up would have started its own conversation. I sat where I always sat. Same room, same overcooked beef, same low light, same men pretending they knew which side of history they were on. Voss came in late enough to be noticed and early enough to work the room. He shook hands like he was cutting ribbons. Then he stopped at my table. He put one hand on the back of the empty chair beside me and leaned in with that polished, overfed grin of his. He said, "I hope you don't mind a little fresh energy in the market." Not loud, not soft, just loud enough for the right ears. I looked at him and said I had no problem with energy, only fraud. A few men at the table went still. Voss smiled wider, which told me I had reached the bone. He said, "That's a serious word." I told him so was pedigree. He chuckled and moved on because men like him think surviving a moment means winning it. What mattered was not his face. It was the room after. Nobody asked me what I meant. Nobody had to. By then, the room had already started doing what weak people do when money walks into an old space. They pretended obvious things were unclear. They spoke in that careful, oily tone people use when they suspect a truth but don't want it interrupting their upside. A month later, one of my oldest buyers asked whether I was planning to thin out retained genetics over the next couple years. That wasn't his question. His real question was whether I knew the market was being repositioned around me. Another man asked if I was thinking about retirement. Another asked whether Voss had approached me for a transition conversation. That one almost made me laugh. Transition? Like I was a furniture store instead of the man whose line they had all been studying for 20 years. Then one of the younger sale representatives called to ask, in the soft, apologetic voice people use when they know they are delivering somebody else's rot, whether I expected to consign the same number of lots the next season. He tried to make it sound like planning. It wasn't planning. It was temperature taking. He wanted to know whether I understood that somebody in a nicer jacket was now being offered my future. That was the social wound. The theft happened in a cold room. The wound happened when other men started behaving as if the future could be announced without me. That is what money tries to do when it enters a place it hasn't earned. It does not just try to buy what you built. It tries to convince the room you were already fading when it arrived. By the second spring, I got my first clean look at what he was doing. Not in person, in a private preview packet that should never have reached me, and did because somebody in that business still had a conscience. I did not need the claims. I did not need the pricing. I knew the shape, the head, the front third, the mass without coarseness, the balance that takes years to build and one dirty decision to imitate. He had done it. Not fully, not well enough to survive scrutiny, but well enough to sell to people who wanted permission to believe. That night, I sat alone in my office with the packet on my desk and the old ledger open beside it. One object from the lie, one object from the truth. That was enough. I did not pour a drink. I did not pace. I did not call anybody so they could hear pain in my voice and feel useful for 10 minutes. I made a list. Dates, transfers, names, events, rooms, possible lab chains, possible registry paths, possible sale points. Then I made another list. Who laughed too easily when Voss spoke? Who suddenly remembered to call me less often? Who had begun introducing him to visitors as if he were already part of the furniture? Who asked questions in public they would once have asked in private? Fraud is never just one man. It is a corridor of people who prefer a profitable lie to an inconvenient truth. I was no longer asking who had taken from me. I was asking where the lie would have to stand when I took its legs out. That is different thinking. Less emotion, more geometry. By then, Voss thought he was rising. He thought silence meant age. He thought restraint meant weakness. He thought because I had not come after him loudly, I had either missed it or could not prove it. That suited me fine. Men like him always mistake stillness for surrender. They see a closed mouth and imagine an empty hand. They never understand that some of us get quieter when we finally know exactly where to aim. So, I let him keep building. I let him keep smiling in photographs. I let him keep borrowing the language of legitimacy like a man renting a tuxedo 2 sizes too large. And every time somebody called his program exciting or modern or the future, I wrote another name down and moved another piece into place. Because by then, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. He had stolen my work, and he was going to make the mistake of putting it in front of witnesses. Patience does not feel noble while you are inside it. It feels like swallowing your own teeth. Every morning that spring, I drove the same perimeter road, checked the same fencing, looked at the same cattle in the same light, and knew that somewhere a few miles east, a man was photographing my bloodlines and calling them his vision. That is a specific kind of disgust, not rage. Rage is noisy and short. This was steadier than that, colder. like leaving a knife where you can see it because it still has work to do. I kept my schedule. I did the work. I told nobody what I knew. People around you do not understand that kind of discipline. They see the same truck in the same place, the same man at the same feedlot, the same routine. They do not see that a patient man with a built case is much more dangerous than an angry man with a grievance. Angry men warn you before they swing. In the early months of that second year, I brought in 2 people. The first was a forensic geneticist out of a university ag program 2 states over. Not hired into some melodrama, brought in through a colleague, quietly, for a traceability method discussion. She was smart, careful, and professionally allergic to nonsense. Good. I did not need excitement. I needed somebody who understood that contested origin only matters if it survives scrutiny from people who hate you. We met in my office first, then in the storage room, then out by the pens, because I wanted to watch whether she understood that all the paper in the world only matters if it still maps back to living animals. She did. She took notes without performing intelligence, asked short questions, never filled silence for her own comfort. When a smart person does that, you notice. We did not talk about Voss at first. We talked about chain of custody, marker inheritance, documentation discipline, the difference between suspicion and demonstration. She understood exactly what I was asking. She asked it correctly anyway. That mattered to me. Careless people ask whether something can be proved. Serious people ask whether it can be proved in a room full of unfriendly experts after 6 months of procedural delay and 2 lawyers trying to turn precision into confusion. The second was a retired livestock attorney out of the Southwest. Not a television lawyer, not a man in love with courtrooms, a structure man. He understood how fraud in this business hides itself. He understood registries, associations, committee language, and the way false pedigree gets braided into commerce before anybody bothers to question the foundation. I told him about the lock, the missing straws, the marker system I had built into the line years before it had a reason to matter. He sat there a long time. Then he asked, "What do you want?" I told him I wanted it done right. He said that was more dangerous than wanting it fast. That was when I knew I had the right man. He also told me something else worth keeping. He said cases like this are rarely won by brilliance. They are won by surviving the appetite of lesser people for shortcuts. That was true. Everybody around a clean case wants to touch it, improve it, accelerate it, decorate it. Serious work mostly consists of not letting fools help. So I kept it narrow. In March, Voss registered 3 animals through the National Association under his operations name. On paper, they moved cleanly. Sire listed, dam listed, certificates attached. Nobody at that stage had reason to pull them. Review rooms do not hunt lies. They process paper. That changed the geography of the problem. Before that point, what I had was theft, pattern, and direction. After that point, what I had was a formal claim. He had moved from crime to claim. That was his first serious mistake. Men sometimes get away with quiet theft if they stay quiet. The moment they formalize the lie, they hand you a weapon you did not have to invent. I updated the list, added the registration numbers, noted the dates, kept driving the perimeter. By then, the social architecture around Voss had become more elaborate, and that matters. He was not a lone fraud. He was a franchise. Men like him do not just steal material. They cultivate a population of people with a financial, social, or emotional reason to believe the story. Some are cynics. They know the foundation is soft and do not care because they are eating off it. Some are genuinely fooled. Most sit in the middle, which is its own kind of cowardice. They do not ask the question because they might dislike the answer. That middle group is where fraud survives longest. This business runs on accumulated debt. Favors, introductions, quiet referrals, sale calendars, old handshakes, social memory. People do not like burning bridges, even when the bridge is visibly on fire. Voss had assembled his own orbit. Not a formal board. Something more useful than that. A regional sale manager who had given him feature positioning. A feed executive willing to sponsor photographs. Two older breeders with declining lines who let their names appear near his because proximity to new money is a hell of a narcotic for insecure old men. There was also a younger consultant who moved around him carrying an iPad and the expression of a man who had mistaken jargon for competence. He liked phrases like scalability, pipeline, market capture, donor optimization. He said them with the calm of somebody who had never had to breathe through failure, weather, or mortality. The first time I heard him use the word pipeline about maternal blood, I knew Voss had built exactly the kind of team money builds when money is trying to substitute for respect. None of them had gone into my tank. All of them were helping the lie live in daylight. That summer, I was asked to speak at a regional cattlemen's meeting. Standard talk, preservation, documentation, the kind of thing I could do in my sleep. I accepted. 3 weeks before the meeting, the organizer called and asked, in the careful tone of a man delivering someone else's bad idea, whether I would be comfortable if Voss were added as a second speaker. Emerging program recognition, he called it. I said I would speak when scheduled. He said he hoped that was fine. I told him whether it was fine was not the interesting question. He did not ask me to elaborate. The day of the meeting, Voss showed up with projected slides, clean fonts, glossy cattle photographs, the kind of visual treatment men use when the product is softer than the confidence. He spoke for 32 minutes, which was 12 minutes over time, because men like him mistake the absence of interruption for admiration. He said foundation 11 times, legacy 7. He said what we're building together twice, which was interesting because no one in that room had agreed to build a damn thing with him. He also did that thing status addicts always do when they want borrowed authority. He mentioned old names from the business with casual first-name familiarity, the way a man will mention a senator he met once in an airport lounge. He referred to bloodlines he had no right to discuss, as if he were adding them to a shopping list. Half the room could tell it was theater. The other half was busy calculating whether it might be profitable theater. When my turn came, I used no slides. I talked about traceability. I talked about what a legitimate line actually requires to be trusted, what documentation exists for, what marker consistency means, what happens, legally and commercially, when an operation makes claims its genetics cannot support. I did not look at him while I said it. He looked at me. That was enough. 3 people found me afterward. A geneticist from the Extension Service, an older woman from a serious Angus operation in the north part of the state, a man who had sat on the ethics panel twice and had the expression of somebody who had just remembered a problem he should have addressed sooner. None of them said Voss's name. I did not say it either. We stood in the parking lot in the heat and talked about general principles, general mechanisms, proper bodies, standard protocols, geometry, not emotion. The older woman told me, very quietly, that she had seen 2 buyers in the back row nodding too hard during Voss's talk. I said I had seen them too. She said, "That kind always hears what saves them work." She was right. By midsummer, Voss had a full profile in a national agricultural magazine. 4 pages, soft light, expensive photos. Some writer from somewhere with no livestock on it had clearly been given the tour, the bottle, and the safe version of the story. The article called him a new voice in traditional breeding. It called his program unexpectedly sophisticated. It said buyers in 3 countries had already shown interest. It quoted him saying the industry had been afraid of its own potential for too long. I read it twice. Not because I enjoyed it, because a public article claiming specific genetics as part of a proprietary program is not just vanity. It is a market statement. It has reach. It has a masthead behind it. It lives longer than a private mailer and travels farther than a dinner table lie. It also had photographs of animals posed against clean fencing with captions written to imply inevitability. That bothered me more than the text. Fraud likes pictures because pictures let stupid people feel informed. A man will question paperwork. He will question numbers. He will question motives. But give him a glossy photograph and a line about emerging dominance, and suddenly he believes he has done research. He had just published his own indictment. He thought he was publishing his coronation. There is a specific pleasure in watching a man hold his own rope. Not warm pleasure, cold confirmation. A week after the article ran, I sent a certified letter. Not to Voss, to the National Association's Registry Integrity Office, copied to the Ethics Chair, copied to legal counsel for the board. No noise, no adjectives, no screaming about justice, just a formal notice of concern on specific registration numbers and a formal request for marker verification review understanding traceability protocol. Attached was the methodology package the geneticist and I had built across months. Clean science, thresholds, documentation, clear explanation of the marker system, what it could prove, and what comparison against the registered animals would reveal. The lawyer drafted the cover. I signed it. It was 4 lines long. 4 lines asking them to do the job they were already supposed to do. Most people underestimate institutional process because they think anything quiet is weak. That is a mistake. When a real process starts, you do not hear it in the sale barn, or at the dinner table, or in the pages of some regional magazine. But the people inside it hear it just fine. Within 3 weeks, 2 things happened that I know of, and probably 3 or 4 more that I do not. The ethics chair called the lawyer and confirmed receipt. Careful wording, standard procedure, internal review. Then, the regional sale that had planned to give Voss feature positioning quietly moved his lot package to a standard slot. No explanation worth the name, just movement. A week after that, a private dinner invitation list changed. I know because a man who owed me more honesty than he owed Voss nerve called and mentioned that numbers had been adjusted. That is how this business handles alarm before it is willing to use the word alarm. Chairs move, panels change, introductions get delayed. Men who were once eager to be seen at your elbow suddenly develop scheduling discipline. Voss heard nothing. That was important. The letter was not public. The review was internal. The sale change had a plausible excuse. The invitation list could be blamed on space. The people who understood enough to be nervous were too careful to say anything directly, and Voss was not the kind of man who could read a room if the room was giving him bad news without applause. He had spent too much of his life in spaces that adjusted around his money, so he kept going. That autumn he ran the promotion. The catalog went out. Invitations went out. The city firm running his social media kept posting the vocabulary of heritage, patience, and integrity like children wearing their father's clothes. He stood in front of the barn for photos, shook hands at the preview event, used the word stewardship with a straight face. He was still building. He was still arriving. He had mistaken silence for permission. That is one of the most expensive mistakes a man can make. I do not need to turn this into a sermon to say what should be obvious. What he did was not just personal. He hollowed out work and dressed himself in it. Then he used money, social influence, and the general willingness of comfortable people to look sideways rather than straight at an obvious wrong to build a market structure on top of the theft. That kind of fraud travels. It reaches buyers, records, future breeding decisions, young operators who trust a catalog because the system trained them to trust it. Men like Voss think in a straight line. They think about the man they took from and whether he can catch them. They do not think about what a poison line does once it enters the record. I think about that. I always have. That is the difference between a man who built something and a man who bought proximity to it. By winter, the association completed its initial review and requested formal comparative analysis using independent lab procedures. That was the correct answer. Clean, slow, serious. I agreed in writing the same day. The next stage took time, but not the kind that worried me. I was already 3 years into discipline. Another 90 days was not an insult. What mattered was that the matter had left rumor and entered procedure. The last time I spoke to Voss before the results came back was at an autumn dinner. He came in the way he always did, too well dressed for the room, smiling at people with the practiced warmth of a man who uses charm as equipment. He saw me. He chose to walk over. He said something about the season, the market, fall numbers, the usual furniture of a conversation between 2 men who were not actually having a conversation. Then he added, in that oily, half-friendly tone he liked to use when he thought he was showing magnanimity, that this business needed people willing to take big swings. I said it had always had those. He smiled and said, maybe it needed the right kind of swings. That was Voss, always trying to put a slogan where a real man would put a thought. I listened until he finished. Then I said, the lab results come back in January. That was all. No explanation, no speech, no little dramatic pause to make myself feel theatrical. I picked up my coffee and looked at the middle of the room. He stood there for 3 seconds. That is a long time for a man to stand at a table where he has not been invited to sit. Then he moved on. His smile did not change. That is what expensive training looks like from the outside. January arrived the way it always does on a working ranch. Not as a date on a wall, as a change in the quality of the cold. A harder ground, a meaner wind. The kind that tells you clearly that everything alive is only alive because it earned it. The lab packet came on a Tuesday. Not by phone, not with drama. A sealed document sent to the lawyer and forwarded to me by courier, sitting on my kitchen table on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning that week. I had not arranged my life around it. I had simply kept working because that is what you do when you have already done your part. The document was thick. The part that mattered was short. The markers were present. In every tested animal. Not loosely, not maybe, not in some muddy zone a clever attorney could talk into fog. Present in the pattern the methodology said they would be present if the origin was what I said it was and not what Voss had claimed. Science does not use words like stolen. Science says origin confirmed, claim inconsistent, independent development unsupported. That is enough. I set the packet down, had coffee, called the lawyer. He had already read it. He said, "We're ready." I told him we had been ready for a long time. The association moved the way serious institutions move when they understand that whatever they do next will live in the record for years. They engaged 2 additional independent laboratories. That was correct. A case like that does not deserve 1 pair of hands. It deserves 3. All 3 came back aligned. After that, the tone changed. Not faster exactly, heavier. The kind of movement that starts when an organization has stopped asking whether something is true and started asking how to handle the truth without embarrassing itself further. That period between confirmation and public action was its own kind of education. You learn a lot about the moral structure of an industry by watching who suddenly becomes hard to reach once the evidence gets clean. Men who had confidently repeated Voss's language began returning calls with assistant voices or delayed politeness. One breeder who had once praised Voss in public sent me a 2-sentence note about complex situations. That phrase deserves to be buried with the rest of the dead language of cowardice. Nothing about it was complex. It was simply expensive. In April, the board voted to suspend the registrations pending formal fraud determination. Not revoke, suspend. That distinction mattered. A suspension is a question mark. A fraud determination is a period. What the suspension meant in practice was simple enough for even the dumb money to understand if somebody was willing to explain it slowly. Every animal Voss had put into commerce under those numbers was now commercially infected. Any buyer who had taken registered material could seek verification. Any syndication deal referencing those numbers had a representation problem. He had a lot of contracts. Of course he did. Men like him sign volume because volume creates the appearance of legitimacy. Every signature becomes one more person who might later say his name in the wrong room. The first public defection came from the feed company sponsor. They did what corporations always do when ethics finally threaten cash flow. Reassessing partnerships. Ongoing regulatory review. Careful little phrases produced by people paid to act surprised by things they were happy to ignore 2 months earlier. Then the sale manager got quiet. Then the 2 older breeders with their advisory names attached to his materials hired a shared attorney and issued a distance statement so clean it almost squeaked. Informal involvement. No knowledge of registration process. No participation in origin representations. That told me exactly how frightened they were. Men do not pay lawyers to draft innocence unless guilt has started walking toward them with shoes on. Then a banker who had once bragged about Voss's momentum began referring to the operation as that situation over at Hartwell. That change in language interested me. Momentum had become situation. Men always downgrade their vocabulary before they downgrade their loyalty. It gives them somewhere to stand while they retreat. None of them called me. None of them needed to. The system was correcting. Not beautifully, not heroically, not at the speed men fantasize about when they hear the word justice, but correcting. The weeks after the suspension were the first time I saw fear reach Voss's orbit in a visible way. Not in dramatic statements, in scheduling, in posture, in the tone of calls. A preview event that had been planned for one city quietly became a smaller, invitation-only dinner. A photographer who had once posted his barns twice in a week removed one gallery from his site. A consultant who had spoken confidently about global interest suddenly began emphasizing domestic focus and strategic patience, which was funny because patience had never once belonged to them until they needed it as a disguise. Voss himself tried to behave as though nothing had changed. That took work. He kept appearing, kept smiling, kept saying review process, technical questions, temporary administrative issue. That language plays well with people who want a reason to delay embarrassment. It does not play well with serious buyers who understand one brutal fact about high-end breeding stock. Disputed is terminal. They may tell themselves it is temporary. They may talk about process. They may pretend to reserve judgment. But nobody with real money and real memory wants to anchor a serious line to an animal carrying formal doubt in the record. That spring's national syndication auction is held at a facility built in the style wealthy people prefer when they want to look respectable instead of flashy. Heavy timber, polished concrete, private preview paddocks, clean sightlines, old money restraint. The kind of place where silence itself feels expensive. You do not buy your way in cleanly. You buy your way near it and then hope somebody opens the door. I had attended for 22 years. Voss was set to appear for the third time. By the time auction week arrived, the suspension had been public for weeks. The people deep inside the business understood exactly what that meant. The people on the edges, new investors, international buyers, status tourists, were slower. They were still looking at the magazine version of him. He came anyway. I do not know what story he was telling himself by then. Maybe his attorneys had convinced him appearance was better than absence. Maybe he believed the process could still be managed. Maybe he had walked into enough rooms on confidence alone that he could no longer imagine a room that would decline to adjust. He had 6 head entered. I arrived early. I always arrive early. Men who need to be seen arrive when the room is filling. Men who have work to do arrive when the room is still honest. The preview paddocks were quiet that morning. Staff moving clipboards, buyers walking slow, low voices, catalogs folded under arms. The kind of environment where people like Voss mistake politeness for welcome. I stood with coffee near the east side rail and watched 3 separate groups pass his best lot without stopping. Not dramatically, just enough. Just a little too little interest for that level of animal if the claims around it were still alive. That is how serious markets show revulsion. Not with volume, with withheld appetite. He arrived later in the same oversized truck, wearing the same high-dollar ranch costume, moving with the same practiced ownership of space. He walked the paddocks, shook hands, smiled, touched railings he had not earned. The usual. He was accompanied by 2 men and a woman that morning. One investment type in boots he did not trust. One advisor with a sales smile. One younger woman who looked competent enough to know this was bad and disciplined enough not to show it. That last kind is always interesting. People with real competence are usually the first to understand when they are standing inside somebody else's lie. I spoke briefly with 2 members of the management committee. Not emotionally, not theatrically, about protocol. About sanctioned sale obligations when active suspensions attach to registration claims. About Clause 7 in the sale charter and the committee's duty to protect registered status integrity. One of them said they needed legal in the room. I told him I would be in the East Paddock. What happened next took less than an hour. It was not loud. That made it worse for him. The committee chair found Voss near the rail where his best lot stood. 2 management staff were with him. So was the facility's legal representative. A security man arrived a minute later and stopped where security men always stop when they intend to be seen before they intend to be used. The chair spoke plainly. Given the active suspension, the cattle could not be presented as registered stock. Under the sale charter, they could remain only as commercial-grade animals. Grade. 1 word. Years of posing reduced to 1 word. Not registered, not elite, not foundation. Grade. One of the international buyers was standing close enough to hear the word. He looked down at his catalog, then back at the chair, then shut the thing like it had gone rotten in his hands. Another buyer asked the legal representative one short question. The representative answered in the tone of a man explaining weather. Pre-signed agreements contingent on registered status were void. 3 deals died right there without anyone raising a voice. That was the first crack you could actually see. Voss tried to speak over the chair, not shout. Men like him rarely shout first. They lean on confidence. They act as if the room has misunderstood them and can still be corrected if they deploy enough certainty. He used words like temporary. He used review. He used procedural. He tried the old move of treating everyone else like they were overreacting to a technicality. That tactic works in finance because finance is full of men who secretly respect the lie if the lie is expensive enough. It does not work the same way around bloodstock once the word grade gets spoken in public. The chair let him finish and repeated the only part that mattered. Registered status claims were suspended. The lots would not enter the ring as registered animals. If he wished to withdraw them, management would assist. If he wished to leave them as grade stock, all registry references would be removed. While they were speaking, 2 staff members were already unclipping the polished lot cards from the front of his stalls. That part hit harder than any speech could have. No fireworks, just staff hands removing his legitimacy in front of buyers. The cards came down. The polished language came down with them. An assistant started peeling off the printed pedigree sleeves that had been affixed beside the lot summaries. One of Voss's own people moved as if to intervene, then stopped when legal looked his way. That hesitation told me more than any argument could. Their bodies had begun obeying the truth before their mouths caught up. One of his own people started toward the stalls and stopped when legal looked his way. That was another useful moment. The body always understands collapse a few seconds before the face does. Voss was still trying to argue the difference between suspension and final determination when the security man took 1 step closer. Not aggressive, just present, just enough to make the hierarchy visible. The chair told him there was a private room available if he wanted to discuss next steps with legal and management. Then he said something much worse. He said, "You cannot remain in the restricted preview area while the lots are being reclassified." That was the line. Not thrown out of the building, not dragged, something cleaner. He was no longer entitled to stand beside his own staged myth while the staff stripped the title off it. Management and security walked him out of the paddock corridor. Not hands on him. They didn't need to put hands on him. The room did that work for them. Buyers turned away. 2 men who had been grinning at him 10 minutes earlier suddenly found other railings to study. A woman from a Texas operation stepped aside without looking at him, the way people step aside from a spill. The younger, competent woman who had arrived with him did not follow immediately. She stayed by the stall for a second, staring at the empty space where the pedigree card had been, then lowered her eyes and walked the other direction. That was the moment I knew his people had begun saving themselves. He walked between committee staff, legal, and security through a corridor built for polished movement and left it looking like a man being shown the edge of a map. I watched from 40 yards away. I did not move closer. I did not need a front row seat. I had waited too long to start behaving like an amateur. What I watched was not panic. Not yet. Panic is private. What I watched was recognition. The first moment a man understands that the room has stopped pretending for him, that the thing dying is not just a deal or a sale or a season. It is the version of himself he paid millions to have strangers repeat. That is a large death, bigger than money. His cattle never entered the ring as elite stock. The registered claims were dead there. The great option technically remained, but it was a humiliation so complete that accepting it would have been another kind of confession. The best thing money had bought him, the right to stand among old names and be treated as one of them, was gone before the sale even opened properly. That was the detonation. Not because somebody screamed, because nobody did. The silence was expensive. There was one more thing worth seeing that day. After Voss had been walked out of the restricted area, 2 buyers who had once been publicly enthusiastic about his program requested amended catalogs. Not because they intended to bid, because nobody likes holding contaminated paper. Staff moved through the aisle with replacement sheets, and each replacement removed language that had taken him 3 years and a small fortune to install. Foundation references, registry notation, program claims, all gone. By lunch, his operation had been translated from myth into merchandise. That is a brutal kind of editing. The fraud determination came that summer. I will not quote the language. It belongs in the record, and the record is where it should stay. But in the dry, clean language institutions use, once they have reached certainty, it said what it needed to say. Material misrepresentation of genetic origin. Claimed independent development inconsistent with documented evidence. Registrant unable to rebut the evidence. Registrations revoked. Not suspended, revoked. That difference matters for years. A suspended registration leaves a door cracked open. Revocation bricks it shut. The part the lawyer had wanted from the beginning also landed. A permanent notation attached to the operation name in the association database. Not some buried little footnote, a visible flag tied to the name itself. Something any buyer, breeder, researcher, or journalist would see the first time they searched. Registration revoked. Fraud determination issued. That is enough. A short sentence can kill a long lie. The revocation did something else, too. It changed the behavior of people who had never touched Voss directly, but had been enjoying the weather around him. Sale managers stopped using his name in planning calls. Junior staff, who had once angled for invitations to his events, suddenly developed stern ideas about institutional credibility. A trade writer who had hinted to me months earlier that the case could go a number of ways, sent a note saying he appreciated the industry's commitment to integrity. I did not answer him. Men who discover integrity only after it becomes safe do not deserve conversation. People expect a neat cinematic ending after something like that. There wasn't one. No meeting where men stood up and admitted what they had helped nurture. No magazine correction from the same people who had called him a new voice. No apology tour from the orbiters who warmed themselves at his money. What followed was something older and pettier, and, in its own way, more accurate. Social reclassification. Dinner invitations stopped. Catalog features dried up. Calls stopped getting returned, and then stopped being made. People who had once photographed themselves beside him developed the kind of memory loss cowards mistake for dignity. The bank president who had praised his forward-thinking vision had no comment later. Of course he didn't. Men like that are brave only in expanding markets. His operation at the Hartwell place lasted another year before it was sold. The land held value because land usually does. The livestock program did not. The donor base, the catalog language, the city photography, the hospitality tent, the glass office over the barns. All of it dissolved with the speed things dissolve when they were never rooted in anything but appetite. The tasting room went first, then the branded event signage. Then the consultant with the iPad found new weather somewhere else. By the time the property changed hands, the place had the stripped look failed theater sets get after closing weekend. Structure without belief. Clean surfaces with nothing honest underneath them. He moved away. I do not know where. I did not follow it. I had no interest in the afterlife of a counterfeit. The place itself went to a family from 3 counties over. Younger people. They repaired the fencing before they touched a single cosmetic detail. That told me enough. I would be lying if I said it left no mark on me. 3 years is a long time to carry a case in silence. 3 years of watching a man build market value on top of your work. 3 years of sitting in rooms where profitable blindness kept getting mistaken for professionalism. 3 years of hearing a false version of you tested in public. The aging relic, the fading program, the legacy line whose best years were behind it, and choosing not to crush it early because early was not accurate enough. That changes the way you see a room. Not into bitterness. Bitterness is sloppy. I have never had much use for conditions that cloud the instrument, but it changes your inventory of people. It changes what you now know about who needed to be convinced and who simply waited to see which way the money leaned. It changes how long you let a man speak before deciding what kind of cowardice is operating behind his smile. It changes what you hear in words like emerging, dynamic, visionary, strategic, transformative. Most of the time now, I hear the same thing. A man asking the room not to look too closely at what he has skipped. That is the tax on patience nobody likes to talk about. You win. You pay anyway. The cryogenic room is still the cryogenic room. Same cold, same white vapor, same gauges, same quiet. The ledger is the same ledger, with more pages now and a hand that is a little slower than it was years ago, but no less exact. The lock is different. Of course it is. Not because I expect the same threat to come back, because protection is not paranoia if experience paid for it. The cattle are still the cattle. Better in some ways. The work never stopped. That is the part outsiders never understand. While Voss was buying photographs and adjectives, the real work kept moving. Quiet work. Unphotographed work. The kind that looks like nothing is happening because everything is happening correctly. There were seasons inside that mess where I had to keep making actual breeding decisions while carrying the case in the background. Flush or hold? Retain or release? Double back into a line that had gone a little too coarse, or trust a younger female to tighten it. That was the hardest part, in ways nobody dramatic would appreciate. The lie did not pause the work. The work had to remain exact while the lie got larger. There is no applause for that. There shouldn't be. It is just what the job requires. This spring, one buyer I have known for close to 20 years came to the ranch and walked the pens with me. He did not mention Voss. He did not mention the registry case. He looked at the cattle the way serious people look at cattle, slowly, without speeches, with attention to what does not photograph well. He stood at the fence a long time, looking at a young heifer I have been watching for 2 years. He said, "She's different." I said, "Yes." He asked, "How long have you been building toward her?" I told him the truth. About 30 years. He nodded once. That was enough. Later that afternoon, after he left, I stood in the office with the door open and listened to the place the way I used to before any of this started. Wind, gates, one truck in the distance, cattle shifting their weight. No slogans, no consultants, no men trying to sell themselves to the room by borrowing language from things they did not build. Just the ranch behaving like a ranch. That felt cleaner than triumph. People sometimes ask whether it was worth it. The silence, the patience, the years of watching a man dress himself in my work while I kept the case clean. I understand the question. I do not share the assumption underneath it. I was not weighing multiple beautiful options. I had a theft. I had a method. I had a business older than his appetite and stronger than his money. The patient response was not noble. It was accurate. Loud men doing stupid things should not always be answered loudly. Sometimes the cleanest answer is a record that no longer lets them breathe. That record is clean now. His lie is searchable. My line is still mine. And maybe that is the part men like Voss never understand until it is too late. They think ownership is the moment they can force the room to say their name correctly. They think belonging is access. They think if enough people repeat the story becomes the truth. It doesn't. Truth in my world is slower than that, Colder, too. It lives in records, in blood, in what repeats honestly over time, in what survives scrutiny, in what still holds shape after the loud man has exhausted his money and the useful idiots have gone back to pretending they never saw him. The work continues. It always was going to. To get this to a tighter target band without bloating it wrong, the next move is a surgical expansion of Act 2 pressure beats only.